You all here. Thank you for coming to the Nantucket Historical Association's Whaling Museum Food for Thought series. We do this every spring and fall. So thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Feel free to dig into your lunches as you enjoy the presentation. My name is Jacob Horton. I'm the programs coordinator here. And I want to first thank a couple of supporters. The MS Worthington Foundation makes it possible for us to bring this back every year, and also Novation Media, who provides our technical support. So thanks to those organizations. I'd like to ask you all to please keep your cell phones silenced for the duration of the presentation. Restrooms are right around the corner that way should you need them. And then I'm going to take a moment to introduce our speaker. We'll give my notes. Michael May has been the Executive Director of Nantucket Preservation Trust since 2006. Before earning his Master of Science degree in Historic Preservation at Columbia University in New York, he studied American Studies and Art History at the University of Delaware. He's worked in the historic preservation field for nearly 30 years in New York City, in Philadelphia, and Charlottesville, Virginia, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. He's a year-round resident now since 2006, but he's a long-time Sconset summer before that, and he has developed not only an interest but a passion really for Sconset history. He's been researching it for some time, a work that may be published in the next year, and we're going to see some of that today. Michael's served on numerous boards. He was founder of the Thomas Jefferson branch of the Association for Virginia Antiquities, a founding member for Preservation of Piedmont, Virginia. He's currently a member of the South Church Preservation Fund, the Nantucket Historical Commission, the HDC Historic Advisory Board, and the HDC Sconset Advisory Board. Please help me to welcome Mr. Michael.
Thank you, Jacob. It's good to be here and to see so many familiar faces. About 9 years ago, when I first got to Sconset, I started giving walking tours and became really fascinated with the cottages. And so started to slowly collect some information on each house. And this material is being compiled into a book which I hope to complete sometime in the near future. And today I wanted to provide you with just a sampling of some of these histories. First, I would like to address a few misconceptions about the early Sconset cottages. Most dwellings are referred to as whale cottages by people today, but they were in reality built as fishing shanties and used as seasonal dwellings by Nantucketers who resided in town in the off-season. The first crude structures were replaced, rebuilt, and added onto over time, and they were soon used by the entire family. We often think that they were used solely by those who worked as fishermen, and that would be incorrect. In fact, deed research has revealed the cottages existing today were the seasonal homes for some of the island's most prominent families who made their fortunes in the whale oil merchants, ship captains, and blacksmiths. The exact date of construction of the cottages can be hard to determine, and some of the dates long associated with the cottages are questionable. During my career as an architectural historian, I have found that there are, wherever you are, if you're in Virginia, New Jersey, New York, or Massachusetts, property owners think their houses are older than research and physical evidence reveals. And this is true in Sconset and Nantucket. Although local tradition states the cottages are 17th century, more likely the earliest dwellings that we see today are from the 18th century, with the majority built in the mid to latter part of that century. There is also a wonderful handful of cottages built in the early 1800s, especially during the War of 1812 era when there was a blockade of Nantucket. This is not to say that some of the cottages aren't among the earliest, if not the earliest remaining structures on island. But no matter their original use or their date of construction, these cottages are rare, and they are national landmarks and national treasures something that we tend to take for granted, I think, here on island. There is no other community like Sconset anywhere in the country. The village plan and the construction of the individual cottages developed in a uniquely Nantucket way. In Sconset, they would like to say uniquely Sconset way. And like the houses built in the early 1700s in town, the Sconset cottages developed more or less with a set pattern that was adopted by the community. And they were very well thought out and functioned very, very well as seasonal homes to withstand the harsh winds and other weather that we are so familiar with. For the most part, these early cottages were T-shaped in plan, and here you see a plan of the typical Sconset cottage. It had a great room. Let me just see if I can. Of course, I can't figure out how to use the
Sorry.
laser. Oh, okay, wrong button. Okay. Here you have the T-shaped cottage right here. And it included a great room, which you see was about 11 by 12, and 2 chambers that were actually extended over time. So these cottages were originally rectangular shape, and they turned into a T-shaped cottage. Nowhere else in the United States can you see this form. And the Sconset not only has 1 or 2, it has a large concentrations of these early cottages. Before we discuss individual cottages, I want to reference several histories and resources that I use to assist in my research. These include Obed Macy's The History of Nantucket, published in 1835, and perhaps most importantly, the work of Edward Underhill, who 50 years after Macy in the 1880s sat down and interviewed the old-timers in the village. And Underhill's Sconset histories are the backbone of research today, and were recounted even in the early 1900s by Roland Hussey in a series of articles that were published in the Inquirer and Mirror. Henry Shanley Foreman, in his book, which many of you may know about, the early Nantucket and its whale houses, was published in 1966, also recited Underhill's histories. Although Foreman was responsible for propagating the term whale houses, his research is quite valuable, especially for those interested in the architectural evolution of the cottages. Many know his book, but few realize that Foreman was one of the nation's first architectural historians, best known as the chief architect for the National Park Service at Jamestown and as editor of the Historic American Building Survey in the 1930s. And of course, there's also work of other historians, recent historians, Betsy Tyler from the NHA and Margaret Moore Booker, who also have added to this wealth of research and actually assisted me in my work. One of the first tools any historians refer to when researching a structure are historic maps, and we are really fortunate that there are several 19th century maps for Sconset. 2 that I will refer to often in this presentation are, one is this 1835 map of the village, adapted by the town meeting in that year to provide clear ownership of the land associated with the cottages. What is interesting about this map, if you look closely, is that instead of names, there are initials on each lot for each owner. But unfortunately, there is no reference for the initials. So things like deed research and secondary information, such as Underhill's brief histories, have been really important in breaking this code. The second map that we use in Sconset is is from 1858, and it really is a listing of occupants of the cottages. Curiously, what I found during my research is that it's not necessarily a owner who is listed, but the person who actually was occupying the cottage at the time the map was developed. So let's begin with the cottages. And I'll probably just talk about 12 or so while we have some time and see how we go. But the first cottage I would like to talk to you about is Casa Marina. It's at the eastern end of Main Street near the Sconset Market. And it is a two-story cottage, and it can be identified by its diamond-shaped window panes on the first floor. I'm sure you can see that. This plan was, it was also early T-shaped cottage. It's hard to tell from this view, I know. This plan was masked by alterations made in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Edward Underhill noted that the cottage was owned by John Russell in 1814, and by the 1830s it was in the possession of Josiah Coleman, who in 1837 advertised the cottage for rent, including, quote, a stable and chase house. Upon Josiah's death in 1870, the property passed to his wife Sarah, seen here at the cottage gate. Curiously, the cottage was not included in the 1835 town survey, and there apparently was no clear title, so Sarah was granted from the proprietors a common land described as a small piece of land under and adjoining her house at Sconset. Underhill recounts a story about Aunt Sarah, as she was affectionately known, that suggests she was really an unusual person. Apparently, she marked her plates, cups, and saucers by filing notches on their edges. She must have been admired, however, in town, because at the time of her death in 1882, local newspaper notices were placed by a group called the Ladies Howard Society, which mentioned she was the founder of the group's preceding organization, the Fragment School and Society, established in 1824. Her estate was valued this cottage at $375, and it passed to her niece, Winifred Coffin, who sold it in 1885. And here's a view about that time, and you can see the progression of the cottage from that early T-shaped house, almost finished with a complete second story. Changes to the cottage really were known to exist by 1901 when Wood advertised the sale of the cottage, known as Casa Marina. It has its quarter board on the roof, featuring a parlor, dining room, and 4 sleeping rooms. In 1902, Wood sold the cottage to Mary Ellen Davis, who made changes of her own and added the second the rest of the second story. It remained in the Davis family into the 1970s. A newspaper account reveals that Casa Marina's neighbor, High Tide, the second cottage on the right in this view, is not an early cottage like Casa Marina, but was relocated to present Broadway in 1898. The dwelling was one of 13 cottages originally constructed in the 1870s for the summer tourist trade, known at various times as Ocean Park, Evergreen Park, White's Hamlet, and even Detroitville, due to the large number of residents from that city. And here's a picture of Detroitville. This complex was found at present-day Wade Cottages at the north end of Broadway, and its structures were designed and built by a man named Charles Robinson, who also constructed the village's Ocean View Hotel, the Sconset Chapel, and many cottages that are just south of the footbridge today. He also constructed most of the Victorian buildings that you see in town. Harrison Gardner, seen here, and his wife Susan Folger Gardner relocated the cottage for use as their summer home. The Gardners, unlike many other new summer residents at the turn of the century, were Nantucketers, and Harrison actually grew up in town in the elegant Greek Revival house at 141 Main Street. And this view is High Tide. It's actually the original High Tide that was on the site before they moved the house, and this is Susan Gardner in the doorway. We don't know who built this house. We know that it was somebody probably with the initials JC who had it by 1835. But in true Nantucket fashion, there was an effort to save this cottage and relocate it. The old cottage was loaded onto a wagon, but it collapsed, probably because it was discovered the floor joists were made of old fence rails. Although the exact date of this next cottage, Nantucket Lodge, which is located across the street on Broadway, is unknown, its size and form would suggest that it is one of the earliest cottages along Broadway. It also is one of the few that retains an early outbuilding, and which you can see here on the left, which was probably used as the original stable. Deed records show the cottage was owned by a man named Obed Coffin, who actually died in Sconset in 1813 at the age of 70. One half of the cottage descended to his daughter Polly and her husband Jonathan Colesworthy, and the other half to Polly's sister. But the Colesworthys soon purchased her portion of the cottage. And this is Jonathan Colesworthy. He was pictured here in an oil portrait about 1805, and he rose to the position of master mariner at a very early age. And the original painting is directly behind you on the wall. He captained the ship Lady Adams, which was built in 1801, depicted in this watercolor off the coast of France. In the 1820s, Captain Colesworthy began charting harbors and dangerous shoals along the eastern seaboard, including the old South Shore shoals off Nantucket, which is really credited with saving hundreds of ships from disaster. Research, however, shows that Colesworthy died on island in 1849 at the asylum. So it suggests that maybe his later in life he wasn't as fortunate. Josiah Shellfield is known to have held the cottage by 1835. His initials are found on the survey. And Josiah's son George, seen here, gained possession of the property in the second half of the 19th century. In 1858, his name is on the village. His name is not on the village map, but there is a woman's name, Mrs. Pinkham. And we think this is probably Avis Pinkham, who was recovering in Sconset at the time, but unfortunately died the following year in 1859. And genealogical research indicates that she was distantly related to the Shellfields. She was actually the grandmother of Edward Lawrence, who was the brother-in-law of Anne and George. And here's the cottage today. It descended in the Shellfield family to Lydia Davis, who held it until 1938, and it only has had one owner since then. At first glance, Liberty Hall at 11 Broadway, seen here in an 1880s photograph, appears to be one of the late 19th century vintage, sort of like High Tide, but it dates back to the 18th century too. Deed records reveal that a whaling captain held the cottage and that his wife sold it to Griffin Barney in 1807. Among the most charming images of Liberty Hall is this cottage shown in the late 19th century. And we're fortunate we also have a photograph of the cottage from that same period, so it was easy to identify it. In 1865, it became the property of 1863. It became the property of Henry Coffin. He was a master mariner, and he was acting master in the United States Navy during the Civil War, but was sent home on sick leave because he contracted yellow fever, and we think he probably recovered here in Sconset. And here is a photograph of him. In 1865, Charles Rule, yet another whaling captain, purchased the cottage, and after the death of his first wife, Sarah, he remarried, and he actually, they decided to build another cottage. And they hired the builder, Charles Robinson, who built the Detroitville and White's Hamlet with those 13 cottages at the end of Broadway to build their own cottage. And this view shows Liberty Hall on the right, basically hidden behind those trees, as well as their new cottage, which was known as General's Quarters and Barnaby's Lodge, which was built and completed in 1881. And that's on the left. One of the best known and earliest cottages is Hanga, also on Broadway. Local lore states that Hanga dates to the 1860s. And although the date cannot be verified, we do know the cottage name derived from the ship Hanga of Philadelphia, lost in 1852 off the south coast of the island. And the vessel's figurehead graced the yard for many years, as seen in this 1880s photograph. And I did want to show the plan of Hanga. The oldest section is the T-shaped south end at left in this plan. The north end, which is slightly taller, is probably late 18th century. Uriah Swain, seen here in a pastel portrait completed about 1790, is said to have held the property prior to 1800, although no deed record could be found for his ownership. Swain was one of the island's whaling masters, and he was recruited in 1786 to establish a whaling station at Dunkirk, France. And he later was instrumental in establishing Nantucket's China trade and was captain of the famous ship Mars. Upon his death in 1810, the cottage came into possession of his daughter, Elizabeth Carey, known as Betsy. She married a man named James Carey, and he was captain of the ship Rose, one of the island's most successful ships. Unfortunately, James died on a voyage to China in 1812, leaving Betsy with 2 young children. Although from a very successful and prosperous family, Betsy's life must have been very complicated by the death of her husband and her father in those 2 years. So to make ends meet, she operated an inn called the Washington House that was consumed in the fire of 1846. And then she turned her attention to her Sconset property, Hanga, and opened a shop and public house. And this is Betsy Carey. So by 1860 or so, she really fell on hard times. She was featured in Harper's Weekly, here seen with a whiskey bottle in each hand. After Betsy's death, the cottage passed to her daughter, Betsy Baxter, whose husband, Captain William Baxter, was Sconset's unofficial postmaster for many years. And the cottage served as the local post office and remained in the family well into the 20th century. The cottage's authenticity drew the attention of one of the nation's earliest preservationists. William Sumter Appleton was the founder of the Preservation of New England, Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. We know it today as Historic New England. Appleton purchased the property late in life in 1943 and held it only 4 years until his death. He was really instrumental in restoring buildings and historic buildings across the region, across New England, and led Spinnea from its founding in 1910 until his death. And just beyond Hanga, which is here on the left, is a house called the Maples. Like so many cottages, its construction date is unknown, but Underhill wrote in the 1880s that the cottage was held by Latham Gardner by 1814. And it is possible the cottage was built by Gardner, a selectman and town clerk who is said to have served with John Paul Jones as a petty officer on the ship Ranger before becoming a whaling master. Local lore also suggests the house was built during the War of 1812, and we do know that there were quite a few cottages built in Sconset at that time. And iron for the hardware in the house was really rare. So this house actually was constructed with wooden hinges and other wooden hardware in lieu of the iron. The 1830 map of the village indicates the owners with the initials BC. And Foreman thought this was probably Betsy Carey. Probably she sold the house later to make ends meet. But by 1858, David Mitchell held the cottage, and Mitchell was, interestingly, a blacksmith with a shop in town along the wharves and extensive real estate in town. I'd like to think that maybe he was fascinated by the wooden hinges and hardware. For much of the late 19th century, it was known as the Eliza Mitchell House for David's fourth wife and widow. Today, the paved lane, if you go to Sconset, between Hanga and the Maples, which connects Center and Broadway, still bears the Mitchell name. And this is Eliza Mitchell, pictured here in an early portrait made during her first marriage to a man named Timothy Clapp, a tailor and bookseller who lived on Union Street in town. And Eliza died in 1896 at the age of 89, and she passed the property on to her son by her first marriage. His name was Joseph W. Clapp. And this is Joseph, along with a bird cage that he made of Peruvian mahogany and whalebone, now at the American Folk Art Museum. And he began his career as a whaler, like so many young men did in Sconset, but after his first venture, decided it was not for him. He did, however, become a merchant transporting coffee and other commodities to America from around the world. And he was appointed collector of customs for the port of Nantucket by President Cleveland, serving in that capacity for 10 years, from 1888 to 1898. His obituary was very interesting. I'll just read one line. It notes that he was, it says that he was Nantucket's most eccentric resident, stating he was an interesting conversationalist, endowed with unusual eccentric ideas, popular with the summer visitors. So I don't know, maybe he wasn't well liked. I mean, I just think that as for a weird thing for an obituary. Farther up Broadway, Willow Harp, or Columbia Cottage, was built in the late 18th century and was the home of a man named Benjamin Bunker, a silversmith, and a clockmaker whose mother, Mary, kept a tea house here, sort of like Betsy Carey. The property was in the hands of William Coffin, an insurance company president by 1835, when the initials WC are found on the village survey. Perhaps the most prominent owner of the cottage, however, was William Cash, who resided in town at 48 Orange Street in the off-season. And Cash, too, was a successful whaling captain who commanded a number of ships, including the Islander, which is seen here. In his 1882 obituary, it notes Cash was bred to the sea from a boy and was unfortunate in his early voyages. 2 ships to which he belonged having been destroyed by fire, and 1 shipwrecked on Long Island, homeward bound with a full load of oil. But persevering in spite of all obstacles, he rose steadily to the highest position. On a Pacific whaling voyage in the ship Columbia from 1850 to 1854, Cash brought along his wife, Azaba, and his 10-year-old son, who shared his whaling pearls. A second son was born in Hawaii during that voyage. The experience, however, must have been enjoyable to the family, since they christened their cottage Columbia, in the 1880s when naming the cottages became the rage. And Cash's last whaling trip was in 1865 to the Arctic, and it too was a highly successful voyage. He returned with a full load of whale oil, as well as that 18-foot lower jaw from a huge sperm whale that P.T. Barnum tried to buy, but was unsuccessful. Upon his death, the cottage passed to his wife, and eventually to their daughter, Mary Cash, who retained it into the 1920s. And Felicite, seen here, also has a very interesting Nantucket story. This view shows the early cottage to the right, so that two-story section was probably built in the 1850s. And we believe it was actually built by a man named Benjamin Lawrence, who purchased the cottage in 1847. And of course, many of you might know who Benjamin Lawrence is. He's probably best remembered as one of the 8 survivors of the doomed ship Essex, which sailed from Nantucket in August 1819 and was stowed by the whale in the South Pacific. He endured 6 months drifting at sea before being rescued in February 1821. Upon his return to the island, he married Elizabeth Pittman, and they had 6 children, born between 1825 and 1851. And even with the Essex experience, he returned to the sea and went on to have a successful career. Between 1832 and 1836, he went to Hudson, New York, and was in command of a ship called the Heron of that port. And his obituary notes that since retiring from the sea, he has employed himself busily in farming, fishing, and other pursuits, residing a portion of the time in Sconset, and also, for a number of years, was keeper of the asylum. In 1859, Lawrence had sold the property to Elizabeth Mitchell McLeave, and she was wife of Captain McLeave. And it was very common for women to own the cottages in Sconset. She held it until 1889, and local grocer Richard Burgess purchased the cottage and established a store on the portion of the property, now a separate parcel and cottage known as None Too Big. Burgess added the central market seen here, moving it from the grounds of the Sankaty Head Lighthouse, where it had been used as the assistant lightkeeper's house. And across the street at Eagle Cottage was once the home of, or the summer home of Thomas Hillier, again, a whaling captain who commanded the ship Lydia. He was married to Elizabeth Smith, and they had 7 children. And their 5th child, Nancy, married a man named Samuel B. Folger, who purchased the cottage from his father-in-law in 1835. And Samuel Folger's initials are on the 1835 map. He was a blacksmith, and he also held the property for many years. His name also appears on that 1858 map. Deeds show that the property, however, passed to Samuel and Nancy's son, Henry Clay Folger, in 1856, seen here as a young boy. Although he summered at the cottage during his childhood, Henry sold the cottage soon after his mother's death in 1869. Folger was then living in New York City, and the island was obviously very depressed in the 1860s, and it was really no longer a draw for him. And living in New York definitely had its advantages. Henry's son, also named Henry Clay Folger, would rise to become John D. Rockefeller's right-hand man, and later president and chairman of Standard Oil. The family included other successful members, such as Samuel and Nancy's 5th son, seen here, James A. Folger. James traveled to California in 1849 to find gold, but he was not successful as a miner. However, he did establish a coffee and spice company in San Francisco. You know it today as Folgers Coffee. Near where the north end of Front Street intersects Broadway, you find a property called Hope Chest today. It's pictured here. It's the second building on the left in the foreground. According to Underhill, this structure was moved to Sconset from Quidnet, which was really common to move buildings at that time to Sconset. And it was used as a stable. The oldest section is the north end, the lower section in this view. In 1835, the village map notes that the initials, the owner was E.C., and this is for Elijah Clark. Deed records actually confirm that he owned the property at that time, and he sold it in 1836 with a house and barn to Cromwell Barnard for $275. And this is one of my favorite photographs of Cromwell Barnard and also his wife Sarah. They retained the property until 1842 when it was sold to their son, Jonathan, for $400. So they made a little profit on that sale. Sometime during his ownership, Jonathan added the second floor that you saw in that previous photograph. And he eventually sold it to Ella Crosby. She was the wife of Francis J. Crosby, and he sold it for only $50. So, you know, it must have deteriorated in the 36 years he held that property. In 1888, Underhill noted that the Crosbys used to occupy the upper portion on Sundays and keep their horse in the barn. But at last, Mr. Crosby saw that there was trade in Sconset to warrant a store, so he enlarged the south end. An 1889 story in the I&M confirms that the work on the structure continued. Mr. F.J. Crosby has made extensive improvements at his store property in Sconset, having built on several lodging apartments and enlarging his store, which is now quite metropolitan in its dimensions. And here you see the store, the large metropolitan store. There are other streets in Sconset, so I thought I'd share with you a few on Center. The cottage at 2 Center is a slightly larger version of the traditional T-shaped fish shanty. And actually this building is kind of interesting because it was built at one time. Unlike the earlier cottages that evolved from a rectangular one great room and 2 small chambers, then had wards, this one was actually built as a T-shaped structure. So it's a little bigger than the other ones if you walk by it today. Deed records indicate the land was the property of Gershom Drew, also a blacksmith, and came into possession of his father-in-law, James Coffin, in 1809. By 1817, Coffin sold the property with a dwelling to Aaron Mitchell, who was a wealthy investor who owned the house at Bloomingdale Farm at the time, today's clubhouse at the Sconset Golf Club. You probably know it as Skinner's. In 1818, Mitchell sold the spacious cottage to Zenas Coffin. Zenas, who lived in the off-season at Pine and Summer Streets in town, was the island's most prosperous whale oil merchant and one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts. He retained the property until his death in 1828, and it remained in the Coffin family another 28 years. George Cobb and his wife Susan acquired the cottage in 1859, and here's a portrait of George Cobb. He was the son of a U.S. senator and a prominent in local politics. He served as the clerk of the court from 1836 to 1872, and he was town treasurer and register of probate. It later passed to Samuel Dwyer and his wife Charlotte, who, along with her daughter, Charlotte Elizabeth, had just returned from a whaling voyage, like the Cash family. Today, it's named for a woman seen here, Arietta Hussey. It was sold to her parents in 1878. And Arietta married a man named Roland Hussey, who actually was the man who championed Underhill's histories in the newspaper accounts. She inherited the house in 1898 upon her mother's death, and it remained in the family until 1927. This early house, called the Corners today, is just north of Pump Square and was built sometime before 1808 by Job Chase, a carpenter, who sold it that year to Shoebale Barnard. Deed references are kind of interesting for this property. It notes that Chase built the cottage and that he sold it furnished with a bedstead, a chest, and other items, including lumber, shingles, and a barrel of tar. A merchant, Barnard was 78 years old when he purchased the cottage, but retained it another 12 years when he sold it to his daughters, Susan Bunker and Mary Swain, but he made sure that he retained life rights. So he went on to live a very long life. After the parents' death, the sisters held the property until 1832, and they sold it to Nathaniel and Eliza Barney. And I'm sure you all know who they are. They were among the island's social reformers and most influential residents. The Barneys were national advocates for the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and temperance. And Nathaniel, along with his brother-in-law, William Hadwin, developed the successful whale oil candle factory business and became extremely wealthy. The Barneys were also passionate genealogists, and they befriended a Sconset neighbor, Benjamin Franklin Folger, who provided them with a lot of early history of the island and family research. And the Folgers material today is, of course, known as the NHA's Barney genealogical record. Their T-shaped cottage was expanded during the Barneys' ownership to include a north and south wing. And the Barneys during this time hosted intellectuals not only from the island but also from around the country. Among their guests were William Lloyd Garrison, Maria Mitchell, Lucretia Mott, and the Reverend Phoebe Coffin Hannaford. And this is a picture of 94 Main Street, but during the last years of their ownership, the Barneys resided in the off-season at 94 Main. And it was, of course, one of the houses that William Hadwin built in the 1840s. In 1858, the Barneys sold their Sconset Cottage and moved to Poughkeepsie, New York, to be close to their daughter. But after the death of Nathaniel, Eliza returned to the island, and she built 73 Main Street, the elaborate blue Italianate house, as her final house on island. The cottage did change hands several times in the 19th century. William Baxter actually held the house and rented it to various people. Of course, he lived at Hanga with his wife, who had inherited from Betsy Carey. And one of the late owners in the late 19th century was a woman named Hannah Sharp. She was the widow of Benjamin Sharp of Philadelphia, and she retained it until her death, and she willed it to her granddaughter, Dorothy Richmond, and she was the daughter of Dr. Sharp, pictured here in the main room of the cottage. It really hasn't changed that much if you've been to the house today. And another favorite photo of the Corners is this one. You notice the man with the mask and the people on the roof. It really hasn't changed too much if you go by there. It's right just north of Pump Square. But finally, I wanted to just mention one small cottage, and it's actually in this view. If you look very carefully, you can see
a little shed, a gable roof shed on the left-hand side. And I don't know if you can read the sign above the door, but it says ice cream parlor or saloon. There were a lot of there's some modest properties here. We've just recently did some research on this building, and it was built in the 1880s, as an ice cream parlor operated by a man named Alfred Folger. And Folger sold the building in the 1890s to make way for this two-story store. It was a butcher had it. It's just west of the pump. You can see the pump in the photograph there. It's a house now. So what happened to the little shed? Well, it was kind of interesting. We did some research, and in 1888, Amelia Winslow, who was the wife of a man named Andrew Winslow, purchased a lot of land at the far end of Shell Street in the village, opposite Wade Cottage, and relocated two shops here that were originally found along New Street to her property. And one of these was Folger's Ice Cream Shop. So the front half of this store that you see in this view was the former ice cream parlor. And the rear section was a similar size shop that was owned by a man named George Coffin, and that sat next to the Chanticleer on New Street. Winslow's new cottage was used for the sale of dry and fancy goods and included items such as photographic views by Henry Dwyer, a few of them that you've actually seen today. And in 1911, Amelia was a widow, and she sold the property with the dwelling house to a man named Lewis Coffin. And Coffin was the son of Levi and Anna Swain Coffin, and he ran a really successful dry goods shop on Main Street in town. It's actually the site of the current Murray's, and he built that structure. Coffin appears to have wanted a operation in Sconset. Sconset was booming in the early 1900s, and he purchased Amelia's shop and real estate. But unfortunately, he decided it wasn't the best location. So there was a new building that was constructed across from the post office, and he moved his business there. And the building itself became a rental property for Coffin. And by 1914, he rented it to a woman named Mimi Nichols, and she was a Syrian immigrant who operated a tea house here. And a 1914 advertisement in the I&M indicates that Madame Harriet Danzer, manicure and face masseuse, could be found at La Petite Cottage on Tuesdays and Thursdays in season. Obviously a service for the summer crowd. In the following year, the newspapers reported that Coffin had commenced renovating La Petite Cottage in preparation for suburb business. By 1919, he was advertising the cottage for sale or let, noting that it had running water and a nice piazza. Minnie, his long-term tenant, eventually purchased the house and cottage and held it until her death in 1948. So, in closing, I hope that I have convinced you that big or small, old or new, every house has a history, and sometimes a very interesting history. Thank you for the opportunity to present this information.
Thanks very much, Michael. We have a few minutes for questions if there are any in the audience. Just lift your hand up and please speak into the mic like this.
Yes, I might have missed it, but what do you know about Old Lang Syne? Did you touch it up? 'Cause,
I knew somebody was going to ask me that.
I worked in Sconset for many, many years, and I was always told that that's the oldest house. So I don't know.
And it could be the oldest house in Sconset. It definitely could be. It's one of those that is really hard to find any deed research on. Luckily, when I was doing the deed research on the property next door, it referenced some of the earlier owners. And we do know that it was owned by the Hussey family, who were really the ones who got the whole whaling industry started. But we don't know when it was built. There's no record. You know, a lot of people say it's 1676. You know, is Sam Daniel in the audience? No, I probably, I don't think it's that early. I know Sam would probably be upset by that, but I mean, but it is an early building. And there are other buildings like Hanga that's 1680s. There may have been buildings there at that time, but it's hard to believe that they're quite that early.
Michael, I was very curious about the old Victorian house at the base of Baxter Street.
Yes, Idlemore. That actually is was built in the 1880s by a family from Detroit, and actually there were quite a few people who came from the Midwest. And when we're talking about Detroitville, the name of that development where Wade Cottages is now, I mean, there were probably dozens and dozens of families from Detroit. That was a family that had a safe company. They were the Detroit Safe Company, and they built that, I think, about 1885 or so. The exact date, I'm not positive.
There was talk about demolishing that?
I doubt if that would be allowed by the HTC. Yeah.
Was there another question here?
On the names, are they any of them the same as you've been saying? And when you buy a historic one, do you have to keep a name? Is there something like that?
No, you know, I think the names for the cottages, the first references in the newspapers that we found are from the 1880s. There could have been a little earlier than that, but it seemed like once the summer visitors from off island started coming to the island, that's when they were being named. You don't have to keep the name, but I hear it's bad luck to change name, especially if it's a historic name.
We have a good question back here.
As a visitor to Nantucket, why do you always drop the first syllable and not pronounce it, or do you?
I don't know the reason. I guess it's. Does anybody know? I don't know. It's just a short. It's a long name, Sconset. I think it's long.
Hi, Michael. The question just went out of my head. No. What? Sorry. I was fascinated to see how many of these properties were bought by women or transferred matrimonially. And is that something that you see just in Sconset or in other places on Nantucket?
I think it's elsewhere on Nantucket too, but it did seem to be really prevalent in Sconset. And there's a property there that I realized there's one deed that says it was actually William Hadwin's wife. She held that property free and clear of her husband's influence. But I think it was at the time, the women's rights were really important, and I think that was part of it.
Back here.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the design of the houses. You mentioned how a lot of them have the two bays and connected in the middle. The early uses of the houses and so on.
Sure. I mean, the earliest cottage probably was just a rectangular plank frame building with a dirt floor, probably no chimney. That was converted over time according to Foreman, and there's no reason for me to disbelieve his theory that it turned into what we call the great room, and it had two little chambers that were like 6 by 9 at one end. So they were expanded over time with those little warts, what we call the warts, the shed roof additions. And later, not really until like the 1800s or so, where the cottages, they were so used to having that form that they would actually build them as T-shaped cottages. But a lot of the cottages also have, over time, had lateral additions. So Old Lang Syde, for example, has a kitchen addition off if you're facing it to the right, and so did Nantucket Lodge. So they did continue to evolve over time, and then even later they have two-story additions, as we saw.
Yes, back here.
Michael, why was it during the 1812 war there were so many Sconset cottages built?
You know, I have a theory. I mean, I think it was, you know, there was the blockade and people weren't able to go out on their whaling ships. And it just makes sense that they went to Sconset because they were hungry. They needed to fish. And they would go out there. There were farms around the village. Yes. In terms of fishing, yeah, I guess it was easier to go, to go from shore and fish rather than by a big boat, through the harbor. So I think that probably was a big part of it. And Betsy's research over the years, Chris's research has shown that a lot of the cottages were built during those war years.
To what extent are the cottages restricted by deed or otherwise at this point?
The only restrictions I know about of the early cottages in town are HDC regulations. So, I think fortunately the cottages in Sconset on Broadway and Shell and Center Street have been, because of their small lots and because there really is no room to expand, that they tend to have been pretty well protected over the years.
We have time for another one?
The Sconset Trust has preservation restrictions on the chapel and also a house on Main Street. And of course, there's a restriction on the lighthouse, but I think they're the only three that I know about in Sconset itself.
Hi. To what extent does erosion threaten the cottages that you highlighted today?
The ones in the village, I think, are in pretty good shape because they're pretty far back. But, when I do my walking tour, we walk down Front Street. A lot of people don't realize that there was a whole nother row of cottages along Front Street that in the 1830s and 40s were washed ashore or were moved. A lot of the cottages were moved off that bank. So not only did codfish come and go over the years, but actually that bank itself has changed too.
What do you know about the roundhouse?
I'm sorry?
What do you know about the roundhouse?
The roundhouse?
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's across from Bunker Hill. You don't know that?
I don't know. Yeah.
Perhaps a future research project.
Yeah, I'll have to check.
All right, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Michael. I'm sure if you have any questions, Michael, stay for a couple minutes, and we'll see you next week. There's one more food for thought. Thanks.